The fluorescent lights of Memorial Hospital's intensive care unit hummed with an indifferent persistence that Sarah would come to know intimately. She sat in the rigid plastic chair beside bed 7, her fingers wrapped around Joel's motionless hand, studying the constellation of monitors that tracked her husband's tenuous hold on life. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor had become her metronome, the only reassurance that he was still here, still fighting, still somewhere beneath the swelling and the tubes and the terrible stillness. 4 days ago, Joel had kissed her goodbye before heading to his Thursday morning meeting downtown. 4 days ago, he had ruffled Maddie's hair and promised to help with his science project that evening. 4 days ago, their biggest concern had been whether to repaint the kitchen or save for a family vacation. Then a pickup truck driver, distracted by his phone and running a red light at 45 miles per hour, had transformed their ordinary Thursday into the dividing line between before and after. The impact had thrown Joel 30 feet. Witnesses said he'd flown through the air like a rag doll before hitting the pavement with a sound they couldn't forget. Severe traumatic brain injury, the neurosurgeon had explained in that careful, practiced tone doctors reserve for delivering devastating news. Significant swelling. Induced coma to give his brain time to heal. Wait and see. Those 3 words had become Sarah's prison. She talked to him constantly, filling the sterile silence with stories about Maddie, about the neighbors who kept bringing casseroles, about the leak in the bathroom sink he'd been meaning to fix. The nurses encouraged it, said hearing familiar voices could help, though their eyes held the caution of people who'd seen too many outcomes to promise anything. Sarah told him about how Maddie had scored 2 goals in soccer practice, how their son kept asking when Daddy would wake up, how she'd lied and said, "Soon, very soon," because what else could she say to an 8-year-old whose world had tilted sideways? The waiting room had become her second home, a purgatory of stale coffee and hushed conversations and families united by crisis. She'd learned to sleep in 20-minute increments, jerking awake at every change in the monitor's pitch, every footfall in the corridor. Her mother had taken Maddie for the first few days, but Sarah needed to see him, needed to maintain some semblance of normalcy for their son even as her own world crumbled. So she'd established a routine: mornings at the hospital before Maddie woke, evenings after she'd tucked him in, and every spare moment in between. The medical bills had started arriving on day 3, each envelope a fresh punch to the gut. Their insurance covered 80% after the deductible, which sounded generous until she did the math on intensive care, neurosurgery, the endless tests and scans and specialists. 30 to 40,000 dollars out of pocket, the billing department had estimated, and that was assuming Joel's recovery followed the optimistic timeline. She'd stopped opening the envelopes, stacking them in her purse to deal with later after, when Joel woke up and they could face it together. On the 4th day, Frank appeared. Sarah heard him before she saw him, his voice carrying down the ICU corridor with that particular blend of entitlement and impatience that had always set her teeth on edge. Joel's younger brother had the same dark hair, the same strong jawline, but where Joel's features held warmth and kindness, Frank seemed carved from something colder. He strode into the room without knocking, barely glancing at his brother's still form before turning to Sarah. "How's he doing?" Frank asked, but his tone suggested he was checking a box rather than genuinely inquiring. He didn't wait for her answer before continuing. "Listen, I need to know about the life insurance. Does he have a policy? What's the payout?" Sarah stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What? Life insurance," Frank repeated, slower, as if she were simple. "I assume he has coverage through work. I need to know the details for planning purposes." The audacity of it stole her breath. Her husband lay unconscious, fighting for his life, and Frank was asking about death benefits. "He's not dead, Frank. He's going to wake up." Frank's expression flickered with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. "Sarah, you need to be realistic. The doctor said severe brain trauma. Even if he wakes up, he might not be Joel anymore. You need to think about the financial implications, about what's best for everyone. Get out." Her voice came out steady despite the rage building in her chest. "Get out right now." But Frank didn't move. Instead, he pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket and placed it on the bedside table, carefully avoiding the tangle of IV lines. "There's something else we need to discuss, something I should have addressed years ago." Sarah's hands tightened on the armrests of her chair. "What are you talking about?" "Matty." Frank said the name like an accusation. "I never thought he looked much like Joel. Different coloring, different build. And the timing was always suspicious, wasn't it? You and Joel had only been dating, 6 months when you got pregnant." The room seemed to tilt. "Are you seriously?" "I'm saying I have questions about paternity." Frank's voice remained calm, reasonable, the tone of someone discussing a minor business matter. "And I think those questions need to be answered before we start talking about inheritance and estate planning. That document is a petition for a court-ordered DNA test." Sarah stood so quickly the chair scraped against the linoleum with a screech that made the nurse at the station look up. "Matty is Joel's son. How dare you?" "Then the test will prove it, won't it?" Frank crossed his arms. "Look, I'm not trying to be cruel here, but if Joel doesn't make it, or if he's incapacitated long-term, there are significant assets at stake. The house, the retirement accounts, the business partnership. I have a right to ensure that inheritance goes to actual blood relatives, not to some kid who might not even be family." "He's 8 years old, Frank, your nephew, Joel's son. This is insane." "Is it?" Frank leaned against the wall, settling in like he had all the time in the world. "You trapped my brother, Sarah. Got pregnant right when he was about to take that job in Seattle, the one that would have set his career on fire. Suddenly, he's tied down with a baby and a mortgage and you. I always wondered if that baby was really his or if you just needed a father for some other guy's mistake." The words hit like physical blows. Sarah had heard Frank's subtle digs over the years, his comments about how quickly she and Joel had married, his pointed questions about Matty's early arrival. But this was different. This was warfare launched while Joel lay helpless between them. "Joel loves Matty," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice level. "He never questioned, never doubted, because he knew. He was there for the ultrasounds, the birth, every moment since. And you're going to use his condition to attack his son. I'm protecting family interests." Frank pushed off from the wall. "The petition's been filed. You'll be served officially within 48 hours. Cooperate and this can be quick and painless. Fight it and I'll make sure everyone knows why you're so defensive about a simple DNA test." He left without saying goodbye to Joel, without touching his brother's hand or showing any sign that he cared whether Joel lived or died. Sarah sank back into her chair, staring at the legal document on the table like it might bite her. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. scanning the legal language that essentially accused her of fraud and demanded genetic testing to establish Maddie's paternity. The nurse who'd been monitoring Joel's vitals appeared in the doorway, concern creasing her face. "Everything okay?" I heard raised voices. "Fine," Sarah lied automatically, then shook her head. "No, not fine, not even close." She called her mother from the hospital parking lot, standing in the cold November wind because she couldn't make this call within earshot of Joel. Her mother listened in silence as Sarah explained Frank's accusations, his petition, the nightmare that kept expanding like some malignant growth. "That bastard," her mother finally said. "Can he actually do this? Force a DNA test? I don't know, I need to call a lawyer." Sarah pressed her palm against her forehead, feeling the beginning of a headache. "Mom, the medical bills alone are going to bury us. I can't afford a legal battle on top of everything else. We'll figure it out." "But Sarah, honey, you need to understand what this is really about." "What do you mean?" Frank's not questioning Maddie's paternity because he actually doubts it. He's doing it because if Joel dies or is permanently incapacitated, Maddie inherits. Frank's trying to cut your son out of his own father's estate. The realization settled over Sarah like ice water. Of course, Frank had always resented Joel's success, his happiness, his ability to build a life that looked nothing like Frank's string of failed businesses and broken relationships. And now, with Joel vulnerable, Frank saw an opportunity. She drove home in a daze, her mind spinning through worst-case scenarios. The lawyer she consulted the next morning confirmed her mother's suspicions. Frank's petition had legal standing, especially given Joel's incapacitation. The court would likely order the DNA test, and while it was happening, Frank could potentially freeze estate assets, claiming uncertainty about rightful heirs. "But Maddie is Joel's son," Sarah insisted. "The test will prove it." The lawyer, a woman named Patricia Chen with kind eyes and an unfortunate tendency toward brutal honesty, nodded. "Then you have nothing to worry about legally, but emotionally, this is going to be hell, and expensive. Court-ordered DNA tests, legal fees to fight the asset freeze, potential challenges to Joel's will if Frank decides to go that route. You're looking at another 20 to 30,000 minimum." Sarah left the office feeling like she was drowning. $60,000 to $70,000 in medical and legal bills, with Joel's income gone and her own part-time bookkeeping work barely covering groceries. She'd have to tap their retirement accounts, take out loans, maybe sell the house. Everything they'd built, everything Joel had worked for, circling the drain because of one distracted driver and one vindictive brother. The DNA test happened on a Tuesday. Sarah held Maddie's hand as the technician swabbed his cheek, watching her son's confused face as he asked why they needed to prove Daddy was his daddy. She'd tried to explain in 8-year-old terms, saying Uncle Frank just needed some paperwork for boring grown-up reasons, but Maddie wasn't stupid. He knew something was wrong, knew the adults around him were scared and angry and lying about why. At the hospital, a different technician collected Joel's sample, swabbing his unresponsive mouth while Sarah looked away, unable to watch this violation of her husband's dignity. The results would take a week, Patricia said, maybe 2 if the lab was backed up. 2 weeks of Frank's smug certainty, of whispers in the waiting room, of Sarah's own mother asking if there was any possibility, any chance that Frank might be right. "No," Sarah had said flatly. Joel is Maddie's father, end of discussion. But doubt was insidious. It crept in during the long hospital nights, whispering that maybe she'd miscounted, maybe the timeline was off, maybe there was some explanation she'd forgotten. She'd been faithful to Joel, completely and utterly, but Frank's accusations had planted seeds of uncertainty that grew in the dark. The results came back on day 18 of Joel's coma. Patricia called her at the hospital, and Sarah stepped into the corridor to take it, her heart hammering so hard she could barely hear. 99.97% probability of paternity, Patricia said. Joel is definitively Maddie's biological father. I'm filing the results with the court today, along with a motion for sanctions against Frank for filing a frivolous petition. Sarah leaned against the wall, relief making her knees weak. Thank you, God, thank you. There's something else you should know. Patricia's tone shifted. I did some digging into Joel's estate planning. Did you know he updated his will about 8 years ago, right after Maddie was born? I knew he'd made a will, but I never looked at the details. Why? Because the previous version from before you were married left 40% of his estate to Frank. The current version leaves everything to you and Maddie, with Frank getting nothing. I think that's what this is really about. Frank knows about the will change, and he's trying to invalidate Maddie's inheritance claim. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Frank wasn't questioning Maddie's paternity out of concern for family bloodlines. He was trying to reclaim the inheritance he'd lost when Joel became a father. This wasn't about truth or justice or protecting anyone. It was about money, pure and simple. Sarah returned to Joel's room with the DNA results clutched in her hand like a talisman. She sat beside him and told him everything, the words pouring out in a torrent of anger and relief and exhaustion. She told him about Frank's accusations, about the test, about the will she hadn't known existed. She told him she needed him to wake up, to come back, to help her fight this battle because she was so tired of fighting alone. And for the first time in 18 days, Joel's fingers twitched against her palm. Sarah froze, certain she'd imagined it. But then it happened again, a definite movement, weak but unmistakable. She jabbed the call button, and within seconds the room filled with nurses and doctors, all converging on the monitors that were showing changes, subtle but significant. Joel's brain activity was increasing. The swelling was finally going down. He's coming back, the neurologist said, cautious but clearly pleased. We'll start reducing the sedation, see how he responds. But this is good, Sarah. This is very good. Over the next week, Joel began the slow climb back to consciousness. It wasn't like the movies, no dramatic eye-opening moment. Instead, he surfaced gradually in increments. First came increased responsiveness to stimuli, then purposeful movements, then the day his eyes finally opened, unfocused and confused but undeniably aware. Sarah was there for all of it, documenting every small victory for Maddie, who still couldn't bring himself to visit the hospital. Their son had developed nightmares, waking up screaming about trucks and blood, and Daddy not coming home. The child psychologist Sarah had started taking him to said it was normal, that Maddie was processing trauma, that forcing him to visit before he was ready would do more harm than good. So Sarah became the bridge between them, taking videos of Joel's progress to show Maddie, bringing drawings and notes from Maddie to tape on Joel's walls. Joel couldn't speak yet. The breathing tube had damaged his vocal cords, but his eyes tracked her movements and his hands squeezed hers when she talked about their son. The physical rehabilitation began as soon as Joel was stable enough. Learning to walk again, the physical therapist explained, would be a months-long process. Joel's brain had to relearn how to send signals to his legs, how to balance, how to coordinate movement. Speech therapy would help with the vocal damage and any cognitive issues from the brain injury. Occupational therapy would address fine motor skills and daily living activities. It was overwhelming, the sheer scope of recovery ahead. But Joel was alive and he was fighting, and that was more than Sarah had dared hope for during those first terrible days. Frank appeared again on day 25, slipping into Joel's room when Sarah had stepped out for coffee. She returned to find him standing over Joel's bed, talking in a low voice. Joel's face was twisted with effort, trying to form words that wouldn't come. "What are you doing here?" Sarah demanded. Frank turned, and for the first time she saw something like shame in his expression. "I wanted to see him, to explain." "Explain what? How you tried to steal from your own nephew while his father was in a coma." I was angry. Frank's voice was quiet. "When Joel changed his will after Maddie was born, cut me out completely, I felt betrayed. Like he'd chosen you and this kid over his own brother. I've been carrying that resentment for 8 years, and when the accident happened, I just snapped. So you decided to attack an 8-year-old child. I know it was wrong. I've been seeing a therapist trying to work through this jealousy, this feeling like I've always been second best to Joel. But that's not Mattie's fault. It's not your fault. It's mine." Sarah wanted to rage at him, to throw him out and never let him near her family again. But Joel was making sounds, grunting with effort, and when she looked at him, his eyes were pleading. He was trying to say something, trying to communicate something important. "Frank," Joel finally managed, the words slurred but recognizable. "Brother." Frank's face crumpled. He reached for Joel's hand and Joel let him take it, though his grip was weak. "I'm sorry," Frank whispered. "God, Joel, I'm so sorry." They stood like that for a long moment, two brothers connected by blood and history and all the complicated feelings that came with family. Sarah watched, her anger warring with the knowledge that Joel was trying to forgive, trying to rebuild something that Frank had nearly destroyed. But when Frank turned to leave, Joel's hand tightened on his. "Time," Joel said. "Need time," Frank nodded. "I understand, take all the time you need, and Joel, I'll never contest the will again. Maddie's your son, your heir. I was wrong to question that." After Frank left, Sarah sat beside Joel and cried, releasing weeks of terror and stress and exhaustion. Joel's hand found her hair, stroking it with the limited movement he'd regained, offering what comfort he could. The road ahead was long. Joel came home after 10 weeks, the house modified with ramps and grab bars and a hospital bed in the living room. He progressed from wheelchair to walker to cane over 6 months of grueling therapy. Maddie finally worked up the courage to see his father awake, and they'd both cried, holding each other while Sarah watched from the doorway. The medical bills were as catastrophic as predicted, forcing them to drain savings and take out a second mortgage. But they were together, and they were surviving, and Sarah discovered reserves of strength she'd never known she possessed. She'd protected her family legally, emotionally, and financially, navigating systems and bureaucracies and her own breaking point. 6 months after the accident, Sarah stood at the window watching Joel walk Maddie to the bus stop, leaning on his cane but moving steadily. Maddie chattered beside him, pointing at something in the yard, and Joel laughed, the sound still rough but genuine. They'd made it through the nightmare, emerged on the other side forever changed but unbroken. Frank kept his distance, sending occasional texts to check on Joel's progress but respecting the boundaries they'd established. Maybe someday they'd rebuild their relationship. But for now, the focus was on the family they'd fought so hard to keep together. Sarah turned from the window and began preparing breakfast, listening to the sounds of her husband and son returning home, grateful for every ordinary moment of their extraordinary survival.